My name is Martin Port. I'm author of a new book available at Porter Press International, JUE 477, The Remarkable History and Restoration of the World's First Production Land Rover. And I'm here today with Julian Shoolheifer, the man who was charged with restoring the world's first production Land Rover, chassis 86001. Hello, Julian.
Hi, Martin.
So tell us a little bit about your involvement with the vehicle.
Well, it goes back virtually to the rediscovery of JUE 477, which was effectively abandoned in Northumberland for basically 50 years, with one brief outing in the late 1990s. And about 3 years ago, I was asked to help the owner's family sell the vehicle, which we did. We found the most fantastic buyer for the car. And ultimately, to cut a long story short, that buyer knew our involvement was very much involved with restoring Series 1 Land Rovers, and they asked us, incredibly for us, they asked us to carry out the task of restoring it.
So it's fair to say that any Land Rover enthusiast who knows a little bit about early Series 1s will recognise this vehicle behind us, which is JUE 477, and it's fair to say that although it didn't look a million miles away from where it is now, it was far from in the general condition that it finds itself in now.
No, it was. It's been variously described by other people as a wreck, as unrestorable, but we took a view based on probably more knowledge of the vehicle than anyone has had in certainly the last 20 years. And careful studying of it at the time that we were involved in the sale of it, that over that period of time we took a view that it was very, very restorable, and actually the parts of the vehicle that were widely publicised as looking really rotten and unrestorable was just a tiny percentage of the vehicle. It was the visible bits, the bits that were just obvious from a handful of photographs and a few inspections from various members of the Land Rover Series 1 Club at the time. In spending time with the vehicle, I was able to establish that so much of it was original, so much of it was restorable, and by having the luxury of that time, it convinced me that it was very, very much a restoration project. And in any case, with it being Land Rover number one, what were the alternatives?
Yeah, absolutely.
Leave it to remain dissolving in a barn or on an open farm.
And the new owners wanted it restored in a specific way.
Well,
they wanted to retain the look and feel of it, which is something that you went to great lengths to do.
Absolutely.
And I was tasked with the joyous task, if you like, of recording that for posterity, and that led to the book, obviously.
Well, we were asked to produce an outline of how we felt it should be restored, and there were 3 or 4 ways. There was the don't do anything, leave it, put it under glass and leave it for all time to just be viewed as an unrestored vehicle. Then at the opposite end of the spectrum, there's the restore it to absolute perfection, erasing all of its history and effectively recreating a vehicle with the same ID. But then in the middle, there were 1 or 2 areas of middle ground. The first was leave it as a wreck, but make it start and function in a very basic way and do the absolute minimum, shore it up. And the other way was probably the most difficult, which was to maintain every single scrap of the vehicle that could be maintained whilst making it function properly as it was intended to do. And the new owners liked that idea, and I suppose I had to put my money where my mouth was. I suggested it could be done, and
you had to fulfil the task.
And I then had to fulfil the task, and it was daunting. It's a huge project.
I mean, going back, you touched upon the history of the vehicle, and one of the key things, of course, not just was it the first production vehicle, but it was destined, as we found out, to initially destined, that is, to be for a rather special person.
Yeah, I mean, you'd researched this history. It was something that I had always believed about the vehicle, and I'd read it written down many years ago, probably in some old Land Rover Club newsletter, that JUE 477 was destined for King George. And it turned out, on researching the factory records, that that was the case. It had been destined for him, and for whatever reason, he didn't end up with it, and it remained in the factory, providing some sort of, I don't know, maybe some research purpose or testing purpose.
There were a few anomalies about this vehicle that you came up with.
Yeah, I mean, the vehicle was in such a well-preserved state, but telling all of the tales of a hard-working life in a very condensed period of time. We know it was laid up since 1970. So in just 22 years, from being built to being laid up on a farm in Northumberland, it had been abused. It was smashed, it had been repainted, but behind the obvious damage and the obvious repainting and a few non-original parts, the actual structure, mechanics, bodywork, mechanical parts, transmission parts, axle parts, all of these parts were incredibly original. And if not necessarily original to 1948, where changes had been made, they'd been made, we're certain, pre-1950, which is when it was released by the factory after serving its purpose there, its testing purpose there. And so many of those other parts that weren't strictly 1948 were actually pre-1950 and can almost only have been fitted or done by the factory at that time in their care.
And it stayed in the northeast for, well, all of its life, really, didn't it?
Yeah.
It didn't have a great many owners in terms of Land Rover history, but it had a handful and stayed within the area. But even then, put to use on a mining site, I mean, that would have...
That's amazing.
That certainly gave it a bit of a test. Didn't it?
And it was in researching the car, we realised that the bodywork and any modifications that had been made were telling us a story. I mean, it was the actual physical and mechanical condition of the vehicle was telling us a story. And I think very early on we'd said this has been modified for some specific purpose. It's got brackets and additions that wouldn't ordinarily appear on a Land Rover and wouldn't have been put on a factory example. And then to find out that it had this tale of use on the mines, and that in itself tells you that it worked very, very hard. It was abused.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that the restoration was far from easy, but I mean, from my point of view as well, as much as it was an enjoyable task, it was a couple of years of pretty involved research because there just wasn't a lot documented about the vehicle, and so every little nugget that we turned up was just another. It helped you in the restoration. It helped me write the book and tell the story, and I think it made it into one unique, even more of a unique Land Rover than Land Rover number one could be. Absolutely,
and I think it tells a tale of of a proper working Land Rover. I mean, there's this idea, isn't it, that they're sort of now they're luxury vehicles and SUVs and lifestyle vehicles, but every dent, every scratch, every bit of damage, every little bit of abuse, I mean, air rifle dents in various parts and panels, tells a tale of a vehicle that actually, despite its huge historical significance, had reached that low ebb that sometimes these vehicles reach, which is where they were actually worthless or of very little value and abandoned.
Yeah. So from my point of view, I mean, researching the history of this Land Rover was my most difficult task, eking that out of the limited sources there were. But from a restoration point of view, what was the single most difficult or challenging aspect of what you had to do?
Well, I think it was clear from a start that the chassis was in very bad condition. And there's no denying the bits that you could see and the bits that were in the photographs of it from the 1990s were definitely in very poor condition. The chassis took us 4 months. That's 2 people, 4 months, nearly every day. And that was dissecting what was there and then reconstructing it and repurposing the original material in.
Just to put that into context, what would a chassis restoration normally take you if it's not necessarily about retaining originality?
We've restored many early series ones, and in fact we've got 2 or 3 other 1948 examples here that have bad chassis. And fortunately, their owners also want the original chassis restored. Right. Replacement takes a phone call and waiting a couple of months for one to turn up. It depends how bad they are, but on average, I would have said that the average 1948 chassis would be 2 or 3 weeks.
Yeah, so 4 months
of constant
is
work.
Really quite exceptional.
It wouldn't be unreasonable to put 150, 200 hours into saving a normal chassis.
But this was an exceptional brief.
Yeah, and the important thing was that this chassis is actually very different to a standard production chassis. And as we got further and further into it, we realised that there were not just differences that people already knew were obvious differences with these early chassis, but there were details that I think we're probably the first and only people to have worked out with one of these very interesting crossover vehicles. Yeah. It's not quite a prototype and it's not quite a production vehicle, yet it combines bits of both, and that was probably the most interesting aspect of the restoration, was discovery of these bits.
And so if that was the most challenging bit, I have my own most rewarding parts of the project, but what was your single most rewarding moment?
That's a really good question, actually.
If you can narrow it down to just one moment, of course.
Certainly finishing the chassis was, that had started to become a burden, and finishing that was great, and then knowing that it was all absolutely true and straight and correct and as good as anybody could have got it. I think the first time we started it, and at that time moving it forward under its own power, suddenly you get this massive sense of sort of feeling reinvigorated about the project. Moving it forward in the workshop just a couple of feet, which I think we did on film, didn't we?
Yeah. I mean, for me, it was. I think undoubtedly you know what I'm going to say. It was probably the opportunity to take it back to the northeast.
Oh yeah.
And even though it had never really spent much, it hadn't really spent a lot of time at all on the roads. It was fitting that it went back and revisited what was its home, and it. There's
been so many cornerstones, haven't there? I mean, it's. You've got the mechanical side of things, and those great achievements where you suddenly realise that the sleepless nights have been worth it. But yeah, I agree. I think actually, on balance, I think that day of putting it back where it came from is a day. How can it be repeated?
It was very emotional.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, I mean, not only are we driving Land Rover number 1, where it spent its entire life, with the roof off and the sun shining and the snow blowing around in the background, but also having the family's involvement was absolutely, as you say.
It was the icing on the cake,
really.
Totally. And above all, knowing that eventually it's going to go back to an owner who really gets the project and wanted it done in the first place.
Yeah, and I think that's the clear vision of, with any complicated restoration, you need to be very clear how you're going to do it, and things do change, but you have to set your sights on what you want to end up with at the end, and be very, very clear, because everything has a knock-on effect, and if you deviate too far from your plan and the owner's plan, you end up with something that nobody's happy with. We've ended up with something that I think really speaks for itself. It's we've preserved, we've not even washed the body panels, and that's absolutely true.
Absolutely.
We haven't even washed the body panels. And something that's fantastically usable, and I think our trip up to Northumberland proved that beyond all doubt.
Absolutely.
I've driven a lot of Land Rovers in a lot of sticky places, and I've trialled early 80-inch Land Rovers for many years, and I can honestly say that the conditions we drove it in were amongst the worst.
Your driving on that day was exemplary.
Well, I don't know. I mean,
it's exemplary as the restoration itself.
It's a good vehicle. It's a very willing vehicle. It loves doing what it does.
Yeah.
I think.
Well, I think we both feel that we're honoured to have been selected to have been involved in the project.
Yeah.
Is this the pinnacle of your career? Certainly to date, you've been involved
I hate to say that because
vehicles,
it makes it sound like there's nothing else to look forward to. But
The best so far.
Yeah, absolutely, without a doubt.
Yeah.
And I think it was one of those decisions, being asked and accepting it, with caution, without a doubt. I mean, it's opened so many doors. I think for both of us, in terms of the depth of a project and the research and and what we've got out of it in terms of the finished product and sort of easing out all those little snippets of history, that most of which presented themselves as we hoped it would go, and as we knew there was history, a tough working history, and we literally found that out on almost the last day of the project. So yeah, it's all been good. There's never been a difficult day.
No.
There's been sleepless nights, but there's never been a difficult day with it. And,
well, I think as two Land Rover enthusiasts and serial owners, it was an ideal thing to be involved with, and hopefully the book does it justice. You've been heavily involved in it, as obviously have I, it's available to buy now. So, Porter Press International, I think it's a bargain.
Yeah, absolutely, and it really I have, as you know, a vast library of books, and I find some things difficult to read. I find them sticky, and not only is it exceptionally well documented in the book, but the way the story flows. I mean, you can almost find every. It tells a chronological tale of how we researched the history. That didn't come first. That literally opened up as the book went along, and I think it's very descriptive of that.
Absolutely. Well, good to speak to you, and great to be involved in the project with you. Go and buy the book now. Thank you.